So, just a little introduction to this second part of the LudoNarraCon stream for those of you that don't know much about the game. In Other Waters is an exploration game about a xenobiologist on an alien planet who finds a dive suit with an AI inside, and you are that AI. And you slowly learn to work together as the Ellery, the occupant of your dive suit, and you, who kind of find yourself installed in this dive suit, but not understanding how it works. You work together to kind of discover how to use the dive suit, how to explore the planet, and you slowly uncover the mysteries of the planet. At the same time, the player is free to kind of study the planet and understand more about the world. So the game is a kind of combination of a narrative game like Firewatch and a more open exploration focused game with biology that you can engage with and creatures you can classify and things you can study if you want to study. And the game just released this April. It had been in development for 2.5 years. It was kickstarted successfully back in 2018 when I managed to get it funded. But really the start of the In Other Waters story begins in the Gulf of Torioneos in northern Greece, which is a place where I was in the summer of 2017, staying on the coast, and I was on holiday with my family and lucky enough to stay in a place that had basically a garden which sloped directly into the sea, which meant that every day I would get up in the morning, and sometimes the first thing I would do would be just walk down to the sea and go for a swim. And the Gulf of Torioneos is a beautiful part of Greece that has this very particular quality that, as you can see, it's a big inlet shielded by two peninsula, and these peninsulas protect the life in the inlet, and it's a nursery really for the life of the Aegean Sea, and you can find all kinds of strange things there, which is what I discovered during that summer of swimming in the ocean. You know, I kind of had a face off with a young barracuda. I found what I think was a sea salp, but really just kind of resembled a floating transparent bag of orangey organs that I just kind of happened across. I saw shoals of tiny baby needlefish that do this kind of iridescent skins, and it really stuck with me. I think I've always had a relationship with the ocean and the sea. I grew up, part of my early life was spent on the island of Orkney in the North Sea, and I think if I hadn't have discovered art, I would have probably become a marine biologist. So I think all of that kind of meshed together in my head with the turquoise waters of the Aegean, of the Gulf of Torioneos, and started to kind of form the basis for what would become In Other Waters. Which I have a surprisingly small amount of photographs of that holiday. Funnily enough, I was probably too busy swimming, but you can see the way just the land just kind of curves off into the sea, and you can kind of see hints of that turquoise that would become the kind of iconic colour for In Other Waters. So primarily, you know, In Other Waters is a game which is inspired by the life that already exists in our oceans. While it may be set on another planet, it's not about mad, impossible fantasies. It's about the beautiful variety, complexity, and interlocking nature of life. And so all of the life in Other Waters is inspired by life that exists in our own oceans, and concepts that I've learnt through my kind of amateur marine biology readings. And this is a picture of one of the mood boards for In Other Waters, which is, I think there's like 600 images on that mood board, just of ocean life and of the complexity and detail and the beauty of people's documentation of that life. I mean, you know, you could see a nice big whale in the middle, but actually the game's really about going beyond that kind of straight, that very typical way we have of relating to ocean life, where we see something like a whale, like another mammal, or a dolphin, something that's big and impressive and supposedly intelligent and kind of and instantly impressive, and actually trying to dig into the beauty that exists in all layers of life, in things like a sea pen, which is just there next to the whale, and those beautiful creatures, and amphipods, and the creatures, the strangeness that exists within the ocean. So I, in part, In Other Waters is about exploring the alien nature of life, and so obviously one of the first points of reference is really our own ocean. So when I was starting to craft the game and starting to build the world, the first thing I wanted to do was really bed everything into that world, to read marine biology, to understand ecosystems, and to understand why they are like they are. But at the same time, I was making a game, not a textbook. My intention was not to make something just impossibly complex or impregnable. I didn't want to just recreate marine biology for people who wanted it. I wanted to make something alien and strange and different, and also something that was about the strangeness that's all around us and that's within us. And this is one of the first drawings that I did when I was thinking about In Other Waters. I think I did this in 2017, maybe just after getting back from Greece. And it also, from the beginning, I think one of the things that really stuck with me was this idea of having some really bold colour scheme, to have something that would really stand out, something that looked instantly alien. So at first I was really attached to this idea of this kind of murky green and this burning orange, especially because very quickly I picked the planet Gliese 667cc, which is a real planet that really exists, and maybe one day people will go there, although probably not for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's a real planet that's in the tail of Scorpius, and it's a planet which is tidally locked and is in a system with a trinary system of 3 stars, 3 red dwarfs. And I love this idea of these 3 red suns that would create this kind of rich and green kind of algae-filled ocean. So this is also the first drawing of what I call a bloatfish that would become a creature in the book, which accompanies In Other Waters of creatures. Bloatfishes don't turn up in the game, but it was one of the first creatures I kind of imagined. So this was a kind of very early thoughts about the game. And there's another painting here where now you can see, those colours maybe are almost exactly the kind of core colours of In Other Waters. Again, just first kind of sketches and drawings, playing about with this very high contrast look, and with the idea of an alien ocean. And I think, in spirit, the pillar gardens in the game kind of capture the same idea I had here, which is these kind of elevated mushrooms that might have these kind of fungal colonies growing on their tops where the sunlight reached, and then beneath scavengers kind of picking up things from the valley floor. But this was just the beginning of me trying to sketch out ecosystems, because of course In Other Waters it's not a game where you see these things, or you don't see them outside of paintings or sketches. You see everything through text. So while I was starting to sketch out the game, and I was starting to draw these images, and I was starting to get a feel for what it was, I was also starting to explore what the game would be, because from the beginning I didn't imagine In Other Waters to be a game that was was a kind of 2-dimensional stylization of those sketches that I just showed you. Instead, it was always to me this game about an artificial intelligence who operates the dive suit of a biologist. I think that idea was one that I had when I myself was swimming in Greece, and it really stuck with me as an idea that would subvert a lot of the expectations of games, where we typically are the person in the dive suit who the AI is setting objectives for or helping out, but would also explore the idea of symbiosis, which was very early on the kind of core idea of the game, the idea of these 2 interlinked beings, one human, one non-human, one natural, a human being natural, and one artificial in the sense of an AI being artificial, but also that each of them blurring those boundaries and creating something that maybe explored a little bit are those divisions between human and natural that really are easy to pull apart and find more interesting things inside. But this, as you can see, this first interface of In Other Waters is really something very simple, and originally I just kind of imagined it as a text game with these directions that you could maybe choose, and you could get a bit more text, and maybe occasionally, like, you've got that bar down the side, which is maybe the oxygen, so you're managing a few different things in a simple matrix. But as I was working on it, I started to develop it more and more. I started to think about the palettes and the different fields, and you can kind of see in the middle there the like kind of core In Other Waters palette starting to appear, and then on its the red-green palette, which I was slowly kind of giving up on. Even though I still really love it, I think it just wasn't nautical enough for the game. It didn't tell people instantly from an interface that we're underwater. But I started to explore a slightly different interface. As you can kind of see here, there's a tiny little compass, and there's a little radial meter of some kind. And this was probably the first thing I made in Unity, and here I'm just experimenting with the idea of depth and the color getting darker, but the text remaining like light staying on in the dark. But you can start to see this idea of, okay, maybe there's a compass, or maybe there's something that a space as well to this game, not just text, but some space we navigate. And then I started to push more into a traditional kind of more interface feel, right? Like an obvious science fiction interface. We can see Ellery's name is there, we've got a timer, and we've got the dive compass right in the middle, and then a set of utility panels that have nothing on them right there, but this kind of same grid that would appear again and again in the game. So I was starting to think more about this, maybe this dark space of the AI's mind, and something a place to explore. But I think also this was a visualization that really started to mess around with this idea. I realized I didn't want to go down this path of the kind of bright lines on darkness. I think that's a very typical thing that we expect to see in a computer interface, and it made sense if we're in the dark space of the AI's mind. But I think that those first drawings were really instructive to me in wanting this strength of color and this brightness, and the turquoise of the Aegean, this kind of experience that I had swimming, for that to come through the game, not to just be something in an image, but to be in the interface, that the interface could almost feel like swimming in an ocean, that it wouldn't feel so removed and technical. And obviously at the same time I was really looking at influences for these interfaces, and the compass, which became the centerpiece of the game. The compass really came out of looking at just diving and how scuba divers navigate. I wanted to begin with something very real, because I knew that the game would be slightly abstract, and so I felt like if I could give people interfaces that had some relationship to the real way we navigate, the real way that divers and explorers move, that would be very, very effective in terms of just keeping people grounded in the interface. So you can see here, a lubber line, the bezel, the side window, how a diver, each time when you're diving you have to set your heading so that you don't get lost. You have to know exactly, okay, I came from the west to the east, I came from this direction on these degrees, because it's very easy to get lost when you're underwater and you don't have reference points, especially if you're diving in a new area. So this idea of the lubber line, this rotational system, became really naturally part of the game, and I think also to me straight away had this nautical feeling of something circular or spherical that would be really strong. And then also on this other side is a factory. It looks like it's something out of science fiction, but it's a factory interface. And I think that I was also wanted to really evoke the kind of systems that you find in oil rigs, that you find in real factories, in real marine biology, in real labs and systems. Not because I was interested in a kind of realism, but because again, it seemed to me that the important thing was to keep the interface really grounded, and if I was going to make a game that was at least a little bit about biology, then I would want it to respect maybe the real rules of things, the biological rules, and in this case the kind of technical rules of interfaces. And so working in Unity just at the beginning, this was the kind of very, very early space I started to think about, with this dive compass in the middle, and maybe these panels which at this point could kind of position yourself and decide how you wanted to lay things out. These simple radial menus that would tell you your power and your oxygen, this little heading that would tell you where you're going, and a little bit of text. And so you start to see like the balance shifting a little bit and the text becoming supportive. And then I think that I hit on this moment where I just kind of very quickly stuck a map underneath the compass, just because it seemed very logical, and instantly, I think you kind of see the heart of the game there. You see the little first hints of like what the game would be. And even tonally in this image, I can start to feel like Ellery's there, like she's calling you an operator. I think at this point, I was still in that world where maybe, maybe it was a bit more technical. You're kind of thinking, okay, you're an AI operator, and, on that side you've got the nitrogen level in the water and the radiation, the visibility, the toxicity, which were an early feature of the game, the idea of reading these signals, and it was still all in this very technical world. And then this is where I got to this is pretty close to where I got to for the Kickstarter demo. This was one prototype before the Kickstarter demo. We have all of the pieces, the utility panel on the left, and we're starting to get this kind of this like panel down to the side with the scan on it, and I eventually dropped those readings of radiation, visibility, in replacement for text from Ellery, and in replacement for her observations. So I kind of dumped this technical sci-fi thing. And I think that was one of the really big revelations in the game, was when I realized that I didn't want it to be a game where you scan things and then you read kind of tedious pieces of data, and you just see the world in this data through the vision of data, because that felt too cold and too mechanized for me, for what I really wanted to do, which was to entwine you as an AI with Ellery as a human. And so I think that what I ended up doing was really kind of exploring how Ellery's voice might come into the game as more of a narrator, and that's where the heading panel that you can see there with the signals became a panel where Ellery records her observations. And all of a sudden then you have this unity between the technical aspect of the game, which is the setting the headings, the methodical nature of the game, the picking these points, and the human aspect, which is Ellery's description and a very kind of effective prose. And a lot of this was all developed in like a very, very loose and very iterative manner. You can see here, like, it's just me working through like the node symbolism, and what's the range of possible bits of information that I can contain within these single circles. So whether they've been visited or marked, they're blocked, they have samples, you can ascend at them, trying to fit everything in, because really that was a lot of the work with the interface in Other Waters, and crafting that interface was a very iterative process that really comes from my background as a graphic designer. So while these kind of sketches, and there's nothing beautiful about these sketches, I think they instead speak to the process of iterating and reiterating the same ideas, and trying to find a way to make everything work, and to make all of the pieces slot together in some kind of system. And I think that what really was successful was keeping this interface, keeping it alive throughout the process of development. So rather than just locking it off after the Kickstarter and saying, okay, that's it, that's done, that's where we end it. Instead, I really tried to explore how the interface might develop over time, and how I could add features to it. And there you've got some of the dive panel designs. So I wasn't also just working in isolation on this. This is not something that in the course of the game I was kind of just thinking on my own, oh, this is in other waters and it's its own thing and it doesn't have anything else to do with anything else. Obviously I was taking a lot of influence from other places. And I think one of the first influences that really struck me was the maps of Destiny. And I think when I was first thinking about the potential of the interface and its ability to represent the world, these kind of maps like this one of Titan were the ones that really made me feel like there's a really strong possibility of creating a strong identity in a map alone. For me, these maps in Destiny have such a strong personality that they express the rest of the game without any real. They express the essence of the game without really evoking the rest of the first-person shooter elements, but they still have their own personality, and you instantly would recognize them as a Destiny map, which is something really inspiring for me in the graphic design. And another game that I was really strongly influenced by was also Duskers, which is a wonderful game where you play as a drone operator in a future where the universe has gone dark and you're just searching through derelict spaceships trying to survive. And the whole game is viewed from this interface that you can see here, where you type command line instructions to your drones and you try and interpret the signals that they're presenting. And I think that creates a really impressive effect of tension, and it creates this really evocative world that you can see through signals and systems, but that you really can't. You never get a full picture of, and I think it's super evocative and really strong. And I love this game. I had the opportunity to talk to the developer, but when I was working as a games critic, and I think he had a really strong insight into the way in which this game involves the player and asks them to be an active participant in the world, not just by interacting with it, but by creating the world for themselves. And then, of course, there's Capsule, which is a game by Adam Saltzman, who's now part of Finji. And that's a game where you scan these dots and then you get names for them. And it's mostly an arcade game where you're trying to move from base to base, trying to scan things to tell the difference between a mine and vital oxygen that you need. But it casts such a spell by really simple design, really strong sound design, and a real focus on its interface. But while all of these examples were an inspiration for me, I think that again that they all have this kind of slight consistency of the kind of sense of darkness or the very technical view of data and strings of text and these dark screens with bright lines spinning on them. So I think early on in Other Waters, another influence that came in was looking also at actually at anime and interfaces in anime, and this is a shot from Memories, which is a wonderful film. This is Magnetic Rose, one of the chapters about exploring a derelict spaceship. And the technical design in anime is often really impressive. You have these incredible industrial designers working in old animes, especially in the animes of the 90s, that have these really believable, really grounded futuristic technology like you can see here, which was really an inspiration for Other Waters. But they also have these really grounded interfaces that go alongside them. But unlike the interfaces we were just looking at, and maybe the interfaces we typically see in films, which are very dark and claustrophobic, they have this kind of revelatory use of colour. They're incredibly bright and bold and abstract, and they border on being pieces of kind of abstract art as opposed to actually being looking like an app or a phone interface or anything like that. So I think they're really strong, and they've started to have a real influence on me. This is an interface from Magnetic Rose, and these are loads of interfaces from Gundam and other places, and all from 90s anime. And I think the use of color blocks, the use of kind of radial dials, wiring and layers. I think the image in the top right there was a real big influence on the base of this kind of diagrammatic view of a ship. they have this technical quality, but they're also very evocative and very colourful, and they really create a kind of deeper world than just a kind of typical computer interface of wireframes. They have a real brightness to them, and also when you see them in motion, of course, being created by incredible animators, they have a lot of movement and life to them. So these also kind of fell into the mix of In Other Waters, thinking about those games that I was talking about, but also about the kind of vibrancy of these interfaces. And then the kind of third part of the influences that all came in to help me change and develop an interface were interfaces from films. And I think that Alien, of course, was a big influence. I think that of course it's a very traditional interface, but as you can see here, has a kind of brightness and a tactility combined that makes it really stand out. I wanted to make sure my interfaces weren't necessarily nostalgic, but I did want them to capture the same quality as older interfaces, which feel very tactile, versus perhaps some of the newer interfaces we see in films like Prometheus, which kind of carry on the alien legacy, but instead present these kind of blue, shiny, multi-layered interfaces that feel very inaccessible. They feel quite far away from the reality of being an AI in a dive suit, and instead feel like they gesture towards a kind of cloudy, obscure idea of technology, which I didn't feel suited In Other Waters. And these are, the semiotic signs used in Alien, designed by Ron Cobb, who's an incredible production designer. And I think, again, looking at these, they look futuristic even now, but they have an incredible clarity and sense of colour and life and character that I really wanted to bring into In Other Waters. And I think I very early on fixated on this idea of not having a particularly not relying on text very heavily in the interface, but trying to build a symbol language that would work for the game. There's a kind of, even within Ron Cobb's symbol language here, you see it like at the bottom there's the lying down figure with the blue triangle coming out of them that kind of evokes the bursting out of the chest burster in Alien. So they were also kind of having some fun with these designs, and they were not just set dressing, but they have these kind of narrative foreshadowing qualities, which I think are really strong. So I love these designs. And this is Ron Cobb's work for The Abyss. So this is the design of the base in James Cameron's Abyss, which again was really important reference to me when I was thinking about the base and thinking about evoking spaces through diagrams or signs. I think this is an incredibly evocative drawing of a space that it's not necessarily instantly understandable, but it really evokes all the parts of the base, and in a really kind of slightly asymmetric and interesting way. But then I think that there was again a very technical references, and when I was thinking a lot about Ellery and the human that's at the heart of In Other Waters, because in a sense that Ellery is the protagonist of In Other Waters and the player supports them, I really thought a lot about Nausicaa, the character of Nausicaa, who is this incredible character who has a lot of love of the creatures that she encounters and belief in the world around her, and is a very kind of utopic character in a sense. She evokes the qualities that we want to see in a person who finds wonder even in the most dangerous things. This particular image of Nausicaa in her garden, in the film, this scene is a scene where we find Nausicaa knowing that she has to destroy these plants, even though because they're thought to be deadly, but she's shown them to be safe if they are given clean water. I think this is a really beautiful image and a beautiful scene about this character's struggle And when I thought of Ellery in the base and I thought of her engagement with the world around her, I was often thinking of Nausicaa. And so even though In Other Waters is a world where we don't necessarily have an image of it all the time, we have this technical viewpoint, I still wanted that same feeling that you have when you see Nausicaa exploring the fungal forest, this kind of sense of wonder and beauty. And I really felt that by investing the bright colours and the animations and some movement in the interface, I could keep this without necessarily having to replicate it. Could become something that's this sense of life could be carried into the interface without having to show the creatures. I also think these book covers for Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy in a way kind of encapsulate a lot of the balance that I was trying to find throughout making In Other Waters. I mean, the books themselves are they owe In Other Waters owes a strong narrative debt to the work of Jeff Vandermeer and the strangeness of his worlds, even if maybe it's not In Other Waters is not quite as weird as some of his work. But I think that these covers really stand out from those books in quite a strange way, but present this really nice balance of graphic shapes and natural shapes that I found really inspiring, and I kept coming back to these covers in development and thinking about trying to make something as bold as this. My background really is, as well as being a games critic, is as a graphic designer, and so I guess that I felt what I could bring forward with In Other Waters was a very graphic design sensibility into games, and so I did go to these references of books and graphic design to try and bring something a bit fresh into games, and maybe bring very graphic qualities to almost print design qualities to interfaces that were inherently digital. And so just to summarize a little bit what I was kind of exploring there, I think there's this balance in Other Waters between the natural and the technical, which is something I always tried to maintain. And these are two images from the mood board that became quite emblematic for me of that balance. The one on the left, I assume it looks like the view through a microscope eyepiece, although I'm not 100% sure that that's what it is. But I love this image of this technical lens containing a kind of growing, looks like a slime mold or a plant or something growing, and the scale is very complex in this image. You could feel like when you look at the tendrils of the plant, you could be looking down on an entire ecosystem or an entire forest. But at the same time, everything, it's very much in miniature, it's very containable and contained in that little sphere. And I think that I really wanted that for In Other Waters, to feel like a game that both feels like looking through a microscope at a tiny pocket world, but also being far, far away from a planet and almost looking through a telescope at the complex patterns that were growing on the planet. So I think that was a really instructive image for me. And then the image of the Panasonic Cougar No. 7 radio, which is a strange obsession I kind of developed throughout the game, but when I was working on the game, this radio became one of the core pieces of production design. It really inspired me, mostly because of its kind of utilitarian appearance that's actually very contrived and not very utilitarian at all. It's a radio that's kind of made to look like a piece of utilitarian equipment, but actually isn't. It's a very stylized piece of work. It's a 1970s radio from Japan, and I think those asymmetrical paneling with the radial dials kind of pulls like little references from things like Second World War military radios with the kind of shoulder strap and the blockiness, but also has this kind of future-facing angular cut-off corners everywhere, and the little screw covers, these beautiful little dials that are kind of unnecessary in a way, like the medium wave the wavelength switch, band switch, which is a beautiful little radial dial that doesn't need to be radial, and you can kind of see the echoes of Another Waters. So these were two images that I kept kind of coming back to again and again when I was thinking about the interface, and every time I tried to design a new element of the interface or developed it, pushed it a little bit along the path, maybe decided it needed some new features, I tried to keep these in my mind as ways of making sure everything was in the right space, that it could all stay coherent and evocative, and a lot of thought went into those. And so this is the interface, that this kind of final interface in the game, and you can see that there's all of those elements kind of competing against each other, or working with each other, I guess. The kind of microscope-like central lens that's also a compass, that's also a kind of radio dial that's both tuning into signals and navigating spaces, that's kind of distant in the sense that we feel we're hovering above the world, but also very close in the sense that it limits our view to a tiny little circle in the middle of the screen. And those radial oxygen and power dials set to the side, and the panels, and then the colours that really come from a kind of the blue of the Aegean and the yellow of submarine exploration. And I think for me, when I look at the game, I'm quite proud of the combination of influences that have really come through to make the interface feel very distinctive and recognizable, but also coherent and embedded into the world. And I think as you progress through the game, and I explored through palettes providing a sense of variety to the world, I always tried to keep them operating within this space. And especially those side panels with the cut-off corners, I think the angle, the kind of balance of angles was something that I was really careful to maintain, the certain scale of icons. And as we head into the deep ocean, I guess we end up in a space that perhaps is a little darker, a little more traditional of a computer interface. But I think at that point the game is kind of marking itself out a little bit. And I still love this feeling that you get in the deep ocean of these tiny little rocky oases of life, where you have the contour lines playing off against the soft circles of the creatures glinting away in the dark, and all encased in a kind of steely interface that is in itself encased in a larger dark area. And so I think that the UI it's been described as very minimalistic or simple, but from my perspective it's really about the unity of a lot of different elements, a lot of different influences that have been very carefully honed over 2 years of development to evoke what I wanted from this world. I'm just going to take a little water break, because there's also another side to In Other Waters. Of course, it's not just a game about an interface, it's a game about an ocean, and it's a game with a story. It's a narrative game. It offers players the possibility of studying creatures, but it's more than it. It also offers them a story, and a very literary science fiction story, which was my intention. And this was an image I took very early on when I was telling people about the game for the Kickstarter. It obviously has one of the book covers from Jeff Vandermeer's work. It has J.G. Ballard's Drowned World, but also at the bottom there, the kind of, again, two competing parts of the game. One is Wayne Douglas Barlow's Expedition, which is this wonderful fictional book where it pretends as if Wayne Douglas Barlow, the painter, had been sent to an alien planet to depict the life that exists there. And he imagines himself as the artist in residence of humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial life, and paints these beautiful biological studies and these beautiful evocative paintings that are very surreal. And then next to it is a wonderful book that really provides an overview of the natural history of our oceans, And I was always, again, trying to negotiate the balance between these two elements, I think, in exploring the game, but also the world, because this interface had to point at something, and so in Other Waters, building the game meant building an ocean. And part of that in the original Kickstarter was the book, which was something that I'm really happy to have managed to do, even if it turned out quite differently to maybe this original image. And it's available. It's available on Steam in the Xenobiologist edition, and it's available on itch. And the physical edition is going out to Kickstarter backers. And this book is a tribute to Wayne Douglas Barlow's expedition, but also to the manuals of video games that I remember from being a kid, where you would have paintings and sketches that would deepen your view of the world, even if the relationship between these paintings and sketches and the little dots on the screen was very oblique and confusing. And I wanted to evoke a little bit of that in my work. And so I was, all the time throughout development, I was serving these two masters of knowing that there would be paintings and drawings of these creatures, but also knowing that they were just signals, and that they had to be recognizable in both forms, and they had to function in both forms, and the ecosystems had to be believable in text and in image and in signal, all playing together. And also a big influence on the book and on that feeling of a world partially described as opposed to fully described was the work of Simon Stalenhag, and his beautiful loop books, which really partially describe this world, leaving lots of gaps, having lots of tiny stories and bits of hardware, like the logos on the side of these salvage ships, and the phone numbers, and they have a kind of groundedness, but also a sense of colour and life and vibrancy again that I really wanted to capture. And I think that these are a big influence on me, and the little pet stories that sit alongside them was something I also wanted to have in my book. And this is a painting of Wayne Douglas Barlow's. And I think Barlow's, extraterrestrial life has this beautiful balance between being alien and being recognizably organic or related to the organic life we see on our planet. And I think this image really captures that very nicely. And that's another picture of Wayne Douglas Barlow's work. And I think that, these two masters that I had to serve throughout development really helped to deepen the way in which I had to learn to describe the world. This is a painting of the base, and I think it's a really good example of how I started to craft this world, which is that I knew that I wanted strong images within the paintings that then would feed into strong concepts in the UI. And the base had this central idea of a stack, of this kind of modular stack that perhaps was shipped in some packed up or rotated form onto ocean planets and then unfolded into this strange construction that could be extended, and parts of it could be wired up and hooked on. And I really, this painting was one of those first explorations of that idea, but at the same time as I was painting that, I was also exploring what that would look like in interface form. And so here you can see the kind of anatomized stack on the side with all the levels that you can then see reflected in the painting. And you can see how the diagram and the image work together. And often I develop these in synchronicity, so going back to the painting and working within that, and then going back to the outlines of the diagram and exploring that as well. And trying to find the ways in which they might both evoke the same thing, or they might sit together for players. I think the base is something I was really happy and comfortable with, this structure, this kind of quite strange level-based structure that might give some kind of depth to the otherwise flat idea of kind of Ron Cobb-like diagrams of military bases or diagrams of underwater bases. But I think also the stacked layers was super evocative of a microscope and of that same feeling of going deeper into a world. And so yeah, I like the way that those chime together. But yeah, as I explored that, I also explored the physical construction of the base, which also meant that when it comes to describing these elements, I had both sides to pull on. For me, it became impossible to write about something that I didn't know what it looked like, and so paintings became a really natural tool for me to sketch out something before I then wrote it down and put it in the game, and also to try and capture the mood that I knew I would want to translate into the interface. So in a way, while In Other Waters it's a kind of seems sometimes like a simple world that doesn't have to be fully visualized, a lot of the game was really had to be fully visualized in great detail, because otherwise there was no way I would be able to describe it in such detail in the text of the game. There's no way I'd be able to invest the UI with such detail if I hadn't have a full picture of the game already and of the world already. These two gifts were kind of really strongly influential on the base interface and the idea of depth and layers, and so again I was pulling from influences there. So I think the base is an example of how all of these elements came together to craft a world that it wasn't just about creating this flat two-dimensional signals, and it wasn't just about creating a painting, which in itself is not a full description. It's partial, it's a single atmosphere, a single moment in time. But was instead about aligning those together and pulling in the influences and trying to really build something out that felt three-dimensional, not in the sense that it ever became three-dimensional as a three-dimensional model, but three-dimensional in the sense that it had width and breadth and detail and history. And without that, I don't think I would have been able to invest the same kind of life in the game. And I think in terms of the world, I think the bloom is a good example of that too. And the process of crafting the bloom as an example kind of shows how I approached it. I think the bloom is a part of the game that's this huge toxic algae bloom that has taken over part of the planet, and it's about the life that lives there. And it's a good example because in a lot of cases I started off with the conditions of the world when I was thinking about how I was going to describe this world. And so the bloom was a very obvious case where I thought about, okay, these toxic conditions that are created by microbiological life. How might life exist within that? But also, how might the player exist within that? What gameplay possibilities did it offer, and what other possibilities did it offer for the creatures that might live within it? And I think that this was something that again was iterated on both levels. That it had to be things which were recognizable from this view, but that also became these strong images that could be painted, but also painted with the words. And so these are, this is the final bloom as it is in the game, and this is the painting of the bloom as it appears in the book. These gill-like fans that absorb the microbial growth. And again, these went through a kind of complex process where I first looked into the biology of blooms, and also the atmospheres of blooms, and also kind of the other elements that I wanted to insert. So I wasn't just replicating things that already existed in the real world, but also was capturing the kind of fungal aspect that was a key part of the game, these fungal networks of communication that are so important to the game, and also different kind of atmospheres and qualities. So I drew on a lot of reference material to craft these, but also a lot of marine biology that would teach me the rules of, the reason why algae blooms form and what chemical effects they have, and then having to imagine how creatures might respond to those. Because having to write taxonomies, having to write ecosystems, having to write creatures, I couldn't just say, oh, well, seems like a cool idea, that looks like a cool idea, because I knew that I would have to write detailed studies of these creatures for the player to discover, and it felt unfair to ask the player to spend their time studying something that wouldn't offer them really a detailed or believable physical world. So the first layer of crafting and zone like the bloom was to really set the limitations, to say, okay, here's this algae bloom, this is the kind of life that can live within it, and then bringing everything out of that, thinking about what kind of life generates from that environment, what kind of things could live there, what kind of images fit there, what kind of images exist in our world of green clouds and algae, but what other strange images like these gill-like fans could come out. And so there were a lot of sketches and a lot of paintings that also came out of that, thinking about the shapes that might exist in the bloom, and these kind of very rough plans, because I knew they didn't necessarily have to specifically appear in the game, allowed me to be quite rough and instead just think about what kind of qualities was I trying to bring out. So see, these are some of the very early paintings that were just trying to create a fuzzy image that I could then focus down with text and might give some possibilities for different gameplay possibilities, like following creatures through the bloom, or these decaying fungus that you might be able to break them down while you're in the bloom in order to extinguish it, and the fans obviously, which became a core part of what the bloom is, which were kind of partially based on sea pens and filter feeders, but also based on the gill structures of that found within fishes' mouths, and also on the kind of chemistry of algae blooms too. And in the same way, those then pass through into thinking about different ways of visualizing that world from the interface perspective. And in the top left, this kind of thinking about what became more like the brine pools in the later game, but thinking about this space that might have these pools or melted rock or elements of toxicity that kind of created these stepped terraced pools, or thinking about the nests, trying to think about the spacing of different creatures and these little oases of life, as well as the whirling storm of the bloom, which was always the metaphor in my head. This was like entering a green sandstorm of life, but then also the colour and kind of where to push the palette, which had a certain set of limitations, and where this red would go and this orange would go and how green to go, and balancing all of these. It was again a very slow process of iteration, but a very rewarding one throughout the development of the game. And I think that was, for me, that's what In Other Waters has been about as a process. It's not been about me coming with a big top-down idea and saying this is exactly what we're going to do. Instead, it's been about, because I'm mostly working on my own, creating some conditions and then using those as a way to bounce ideas off myself. So setting down, okay, we've got this algae bloom, then doing the research and bringing that back, doing the visual referencing, bringing that back, and having things to bounce off, always somewhere to look that would provide new ideas and new ways of me deepening and building the world. So that every time I went over the interface, every time I went over the world, I would just be able to add another layer of depth until I really felt that I'd internalized all the ideas and was able to express them. And I think that's kind of the path. This is a drawing that I did in December 2017 of Ellery. The first drawing of Ellery really in her dive suit, looking at the 3 stars of the ocean, and already Baikal was a word there for me. This is done in a cafe in Bucharest, in less than kind of 30 seconds worth of sketching, just hammering down some ideas that really became the kind of central image of the game. And I think I have a lot of belief in that process, in beginning with something that has a evocative possibility, and then honing it until you reach something which fulfills that. And I hope that's what In Other Waters manages to do. It's been a massive learning process for me as a developer, being my first commercial game, but I really enjoyed having a space that gave me the chance to engage with the project over many years, and to really build that depth. And I think the most satisfying thing has been seeing people really engage with that depth and value that depth, and value this world and believe in this world as a fictional world, and maybe start to then use that as a way of reflecting back on our world as well. And that's been really nice, and it's really I think people have been very generous with the game and given it their space and time and invested in a slightly strange interface, but got through that barrier and then learnt to live with the game. So that's been really great to see. So that's kind of a little bit of an insight into how I built the game and how I worked through it. And that's also the last section of my stream for LudoNarraCon. This is going to be launched looping all weekend. I've got to go away and set up the loop now, but it will be playing all weekend. And I hope that some of you pick up the game and try to find your own way in the world that I've spent this time crafting. And I hope you enjoy it, and please let me know if you do. I'm on Twitter at JumpOverTheAge. That's the name of my development studio, and hopefully continue to make many more games as well. And you can also find In Other Waters at In Other Waters on Twitter as well. And thank you for watching this talk. Thank you for watching LudoNarraCon and thinking about In Other Waters. And I will see you soon.